Chapter 11. "You can't do it, Sig," said Victor. "You can't kill her." "Actually, I can," said Sig as the carriage lurched forward. Victor gripped the reins of the horses as they galloped ahead. "It won't make any difference," said Victor. "That's exactly what happened when we tried to stop Daniel Young. It didn't make any difference." "What are you saying?" snapped Sig. "We should just let Sarah Hawkins sacrifice Chloe Baldwin to her demon? Is that the moral high ground?" "Sig," shouted Victor in an angry tone, "we are nothing to the force of time. The last time we tried to mess with it, we were slapped back in our places." "I will endure a slap to save Chloe," said Sig in a low and determined tone. The wind tossed his hair back and rustled his long coat. Victor had to admit his determination to save Chloe from Sarah Hawkins's scheme was impressive. He had no moral objection to killing the demon prophetess. She was a savage murderer, responsible for an incomprehensible amount of pain and suffering. The body of the patient that she had butchered was scattered across the hospital room. She had used the blood of an elderly man to add credibility to her disguise as a distressed patient. Certainly, Victor was not advocating that Sarah Hawkins should be spared. In fact, were they to encounter her in their own time again, he would volunteer to pull the trigger himself to end her life. The objection was based on a fear that time itself had some sort of sentience, or if it was not sentience, it was a blind path, a natural course. They had learned from trying to kill Daniel Young to prevent the damage that was done by Abaddon from occurring and to redeem the world from the state in which they had found it. They had believed that they could change the past and save the future. The world into which they had been born was a rotting husk, where humanity had degenerated into slavers or experimented with bodily augmentations in order to demonstrate their evolutionary fitness over others. Of course, demon worship also claimed its share of lives, where the members of the Archdemon's Hand organization brutally raised and sacrificed humans in order to preserve themselves and their powers. If the world of their future had been a person, it would have been similar to some of the patients in Ethan McCarthy's tower, which were afflicted by failing sanity and hoped only that death would quickly come and end the suffering. In their hope to save the world, they had gone back in time, only to find that their arrival aided the coming of the destroyer. Destiny had forced them to condemn their world to the very fate from which they had hoped to save it. In a bold attempt to right the wrong, they had attempted to take out the man that betrayed them and become the destroyer. Their noble efforts were rewarded by being thrown back into their own times several years apart, and with the knowledge that they had failed. They had later learned from Jennifer that there were numerous individuals that were a part of the same cult of the Archdemon, and that another had risen to take Daniel Young's place as Abaddon. Destiny could not be changed. The memory of how difficult it had been to scrape by in their own time haunted Victor. They had been fighting augments and demon worshippers constantly until Jennifer came, and even then they had only just escaped being destroyed when the power of her time key delivered them into the distant past. Changing time not only seemed impossible, but even attempting to do so seemed to carry serious consequences. They were like mosquitoes buzzing in the ear of a giant, begging it to walk a different direction. Victor wondered how many times they could endure being swatted before they were killed. "Sig, I don't know that we can survive another trip to our own time," said Victor in a low voice. "I'm not saying we shouldn't try to help Chloe, but I am saying that if we go too far, it's not likely that we will all survive again. You will probably survive, but what about Lucas? What about Stephanie? What about Lizard? Which of them are you willing to risk?" "They know the consequences," snapped Sig. "Do they?" asked Victor. Lucas, Lizard, and Row 82 are still gone. Do they know the consequences? Sig turned and looked at Victor. What do you want from me? Asked Sig in a low voice. I want you to promise that you will not kill Sarah Hawkins, said Victor. Sig lowered his head and looked forward again. He knew that Victor was right. He felt a slight amount of shame since he was typically the one to calm his friends down. He was typically the one to condone mercy and promote the ideal that even the most broken things are capable of redemption. He had really only strayed from these ideals once before in his life. It had been while he was trying to save Stephanie Mason from Zeta 28 and her repurposed William Fine puppet. This time, Victor had maintained the cool head, and when this ordeal was over, Sig was determined to thank him for it. You too, shouted Victor as he turned his head back. Kirana had heard the entire discussion. She was perched with a sniper rifle on top of the carriage. We didn't get sent back in time when we stopped Abaddon in Antarctica, said Kirana. How do you know we'll get sent back this time? We didn't get sent back because we didn't change anything, countered Victor. I am definitely in favor of trying to rescue Chloe Baldwin without killing Sarah Hawkins, who we know has to survive. Kirana shook her head and pulled a dark lock of hair behind her ear. I'm still not convinced, she said. Are you willing to risk Jonathan's life on the chance that killing her is the right call? Asked Victor. Kirana's eyes narrowed. She wanted to slap Victor for even suggesting that Jonathan would be at risk. She clenched her fists. No, she finally said. Then promise, said Victor clearly. She paused and rolled her eyes. Fine, she said. I promise. Good, said Victor. There, said Sig, interrupting Victor and pointing in the distance. Victor turned ahead and caught a glimpse of a dark carriage on the horizon. They urged the horses forward. Dust flew up in a cloud behind them as they raced to pursue the carriage. Sig squinted his eyes as he strained to see what was happening on the carriage after which they were chasing. The driver of the carriage wore a cloak that stood out against the setting sun. The orange and red colors in the sky made the entire carriage seem black in contrast. The clouds that had been white earlier in the afternoon took on a dark purple hue as they hovered over the meadows in the distance. The entire scene might have felt relaxing were it not for the presence of Chloe Baldwin being dragged away by a murderous witch with the power to accurately predict their every move. Sig turned back and looked at Kirana. He wished that Lucas was there instead. He might have come up with a strategy that would be impressive even if she saw it coming. Kirana's white coat fluttered in the breeze as they moved. In spite of the bumpy road, she maintained remarkably still as she stared through the scope on her sniper rifle. Can we cripple the carriage? Asked Sig. I think so, said Kirana. She squeezed the trigger and the rifle thundered. Her bullet had been aimed at one of the axles, and she felt confident that it would hit its target. Unfortunately, the carriage suddenly turned to the side as she shot, and a small puff of dust appeared several yards away from her intended target. Kirana grumbled as she attempted to aim again. Hearing the shot made Jonathan poke his head out of the carriage. You've found them? He asked. No, I just thought I'd get a deer while we were out here, said Kirana in an irritated tone. Jonathan laughed cheerfully. Say, can't you mind control them like William Fine? You know I've tried, said Jonathan. The soul key can do some convincing, but it can't make people do things they think are completely unreasonable. It's a key that provides presence, not total dominance. Still, I might be able to get them to pull over, said Jonathan as he gripped his key. His eyes glowed for a moment, and he slumped over. In the mind realm, he was able to leap over to the other carriage. Sarah Hawkins was driving it, and inside, Chloe Baldwin screamed angrily. "Let me out!" screamed Chloe. There was no trace of pleading in her tone. She was commanding Sarah. Of course, the demon prophetess seemed uninterested in heeding her commands. "What do you intend to do?" Jonathan asked Sarah. "Sacrifice Chloe Baldwin," replied Sarah. "You have many other people you regularly murder," said Jonathan. "That is true," said Sarah in a cold tone. "Why risk so much to get Chloe?" asked Jonathan. Sarah smiled, but did not turn to face Jonathan. She urged the horses to go faster. "Sacrificing divine key-bearers will unlock incredible power that will allow us to survive and retain our abilities for 1,000 years, said Sarah. "They are not like other sacrifices. They are chosen." "Chosen for what?" asked Jonathan. "They are the ultimate human sacrifices," said Sarah. "With their power, we might even defeat the archdemon himself." Jonathan raised an eyebrow in confusion. He had never heard this type of description attributed to divine key-bearers. The words ultimate human sacrifices sent a shiver down his spine. She said the words with an unholy confidence. She believed them, and even though he was unsure of their true meaning, he knew it was not good. "What do you mean, ultimate human sacrifices?" asked Jonathan. Before she could answer the question, a shadowy blade emerged from above her and sliced through her. She did not appear to be physically hurt, but she immediately slumped over. Jonathan felt the mind realm evaporate around him and found himself in the bouncing carriage still pursuing Chloe. "She slumped over," shouted Kirana. She turned to Jonathan. "Great work, Jonathan." He smiled widely. Kirana checked her scope again. Chloe was in the back part of the carriage, pounding on the door. "I think I can get Chloe out, Sig," said Kirana. "Do it then," shouted Sig. Kirana gripped her key and her eyes began glowing. Suddenly the key erupted to become a shining, fiery blade. "Get us close," shouted Kirana. Sig and Victor urged the horses to go faster. Within a few minutes they were next to the carriage. Chloe's eyes grew wide as she saw Sig and Victor, and then Kirana holding a burning blade. Kirana motioned for Chloe to get back. She pulled herself against the rear of the carriage, and in a swift motion, Kirana sliced the carriage in half. Sig and Victor began pulling the reins to slow their carriage as the part with Chloe skidded across the dusty road. The part with Sarah Hawkins slumped on the seat continued on with the horses until it was out of sight. As the carriage stopped, Victor leapt down and placed a hand on Chloe's forehead. A moment later she opened her eyes. Sig rushed up and grabbed her hand. She smiled widely. "Sarah Hawkins?" she muttered as she looked around. "Escaped," said Sig with a frown. Chloe squeezed Sig's hand. "It's okay," she said. "Thank you for coming after me." He smiled softly. Jonathan looked to the horizon. He felt as though he had come close to something important, and it had slipped away. He had no idea what the shadowy sword was that had stopped her, but it seemed as though someone was keeping something from them. He turned to his friends. They did not notice as he clenched his fists. "Ultimate human sacrifices," he whispered in horror. Suddenly he heard Samuel's voice in his mind. "Jonathan, you should be able to," said Samuel. Suddenly he was cut short. The helpless feeling he had experienced when he was hauled by blood demon worshippers in the hot zone came rushing into his heart. The divine key guardians were being hunted.